Okay, so it's no Holosun with all its bells and whistles, but it's still really good. Okay, so last time we talked, we were looking at pistol sights and more specifically like the big glashers, as I call them. As a summary of that past video for the SRO and the 507 comp, which I'll leave a link in the comments if you haven't already seen it, both of them would have made great choices for either competition or outside the waistband carry. So knowing that big glasher category is starting to be a thing now, we do have one more addition to that, which is this Bushnell, their RXM-300. So you remember Bushnell's kind of an old familiar name. When I first started YouTube, one of the first few videos I made was the TRS-25, the red dot, and the LPVO. So that was a long time ago. And just like me, they're still around trying to make some decent stuff. So given that we've got two big movers already in the big glasser department with the Trijicon and the Holosun, how can Bushnell kind of fit into that category? Well, after putting a ton of rounds through this thing, both in just practice and also with some matches, I can tell you that surprisingly, they did a really good job with just a simple red dot that works all the time on big glass and it's easy to see even the brightest of sunlight. Really, unless you need a multi-reticle solution like the Holosun, take a look at this Bushnell, considering that it's priced much lower than the Holosun. So for the reasons why I say that, we're gonna take a close look at it right now. We'll start with the outside, with the externals and profile, and we'll zoom in and take a look at the glass and the reticle. So dimensionally, you're going to have a larger profile to make room for all that glass. Length and height-wise, it's about the same as the Trijicon SRO. You'll recognize that familiar overhang from the SRO design where the glass kind of sits noticeably closer to the ejection port versus the 507, which is kind of straight up and flatter. Because of that, I checked for some brass hits on the glass, but didn't notice any. Although after I was done shooting, there was usually some carbon residue that I had to wipe off at the end of every range session. If you remember, when we looked at the SRO, the 507 comp side to side, the 507 was wider than SRO, but not as tall. Well, the Bushnell decided to close that gap, so it's both wider and taller. So technically, you're moving to the biggest glass you can get for a pistol dot. Lastly, this does mount to an RMR SRO footprint, so you're good to go there for most pistols. However, you want to pay attention to the 3 sets of screw lengths, as you'll want to use the medium screw lengths for pistol sights. But if you're thinking about mounting this to a long gun, which you can use either the included low profile mount for shotguns and AKs, and you'll need the short screws for those, or the high-rise spacer mount for the AR or PCC with the long screws. The high-rise mount looks to be about lower 1/3 co-witness in height to me, especially if you throw a magnifier behind it and then it aligns perfectly. So your magnifier, you'll need to use a spacer with it. Okay, since we're talking externals, let's take a closer look at the controls. So similar to the SRO and the 507, the adjustment turrets also share the same 1 MOA clicks in between them. Functionally, these work well, although the clicks between them on the Bushnell don't feel as positive or as responsive as the SRO or the 507, so they're a little bit lower quality. Dimensionally, they're very low profile, so it won't be easy to knock them off. One last note about this turret is that you do need to use the Bushnell tool shipped with it, as I found the slot is too small for a coin or even the Holosun tool that I use for other sights. Don't lose that tool, or just pack yourself an extra small thin screwdriver as a backup. Speaking of small, the brightness controls are lined up similar to the SRO in that you have up brightness on the left and down brightness on the right. However, they're not near as large or tactile, so you have to do a little bit of searching with your finger. When you're pressing down on the button, you eventually feel the click, so you do have to go a little bit deeper than you think. And lastly, it does have a top-mounted battery tray just like the SRO. However, the top rear bezel doesn't go back as far, so when you go to replace the battery, you're not maneuvering your coin or screwdriver at some weird angles to get to it. So now with the externals out of the way, let's take a closer look at the glass and reticle. So when we're talking glass quality, we're looking for center clarity, any presence of edge distortion, or any strong color tints. Even though you're typically target focused anyway, if targets change in size or shape as they're moving through the glass, it can be a little bit disorienting. So for the Bushnell, distortion is well controlled, so it's got a clear center, and you really only notice a little bit of warpiness towards the outer edge of the housing. For comparison, it's certainly as clear as the Holosun or the SRO. Especially when your target focus is centered up where the glass is the clearest, you're not going to notice that little bit of edge distortion. As to the lens color, the blue coating is pretty well controlled. It's certainly a lot less bluish than the 507 comp, no matter the angle of sunlight that's hitting the lens. But just remember that coating does help extend battery life, so just like the SRO, the Bushnell doesn't have the same long 50,000 hours as the 507 comp, but it's still really good at 30,000 hours or 3 years on the medium setting. Although my guess is that you're going to run at a higher brightness and medium most of the time. That battery life can be extended though, since this optic does have a shake awake feature. So after 2 minutes of inactivity, the reticle will turn off and it'll wake up at the slightest movement. And speaking Speaking of reticle brightness, you will see a bit of reticle glare off the housing. It's a bit more than the Holosun. So on sunny days, it can be a little bit distracting if you're at max brightness. Probably a good idea to run it a little bit lower. Having said that, I didn't have any issues with unwanted glare in my 2 days of competition out in the desert in mixed cloudy and sunny conditions. In competition, you're usually constantly on the move anyway, so any sunlight hitting the lens housing will be constantly changing angles. So it hasn't been an issue in practical usage. So now that you have the dot on maximum, you can see the reticle in more detail. How does it look compared to the SRO on 507? As far as brightness on the sunniest days, you can see that it has no problem matching the brightest setting on both. That was the case at both my test range and the Vegas Desert Suns, so it's certainly more than enough daylight bright. As far as clarity, I think it looks clean in bright sunlight, even max brightness, so I don't really see any blooming or star bursting. But if you move in the shadow or lower light, the reticle does tend to look more bloomish, and it doesn't look as clean. Typically, dot clarity isn't that big of an issue for me since you're focused on the target anyways, and you're usually shooting in good light. Speaking of that reticle, it's listed here as a 4 MOA dot on paper, so technically it's twice as large as the 507 comp's smallest 2 MOA reticle, and it's slightly smaller than SRO's 5 MOA dot. In practice though, it looks smaller than 4 MOA, so especially in bright sunlight. So it's definitely precise enough for longer range, but at the same time, it's still visible enough that you won't lose it during recoil. It really only approaches 4 MOA as far as sizing in lower lighting conditions when you have more bloom. And one last note about that brightness is you only get the brightest setting under manual control. In other words, using the left and right buttons to change your brightness. In contrast to that, Bushnell also has an auto brightness mode called LSC that'll auto adjust the reticle based on your ambient conditions. But just like the RMR, those auto modes tend to not work very well. So after holding the plus key for 3 seconds, you'll enter that mode, and you notice the reticle brightness does adjust as you're moving from shade to sunlight. But when it's in sunlight, you'll notice that it's not really that bright. It's not bright enough for daylight conditions. That's because the auto brightness mode only works using the mid settings, so it never gets any brighter. Because of that, in my opinion, I don't think that makes this feature worthwhile, so just stick to manual brightness control. Okay, fellas, so for final thoughts on this thing, we always look at pricing because that's really super important. So if you look at the pricing for this Bushnell, it's around $300. So that's almost $100 less than the Holosun, which is really, if you think about the difference in the Holosun and the SRO, is also about $100. So it's undercutting those two optics. So what do you get for that $100 difference between this and the Holosun 507 comp, which are the kind of the low price leaders now and the big glashers? Well, the two obvious differences are the multi-reticles. So if you want multi-reticles and you want that donut, then for sure get the Holosun. And the second big difference is red and green. So some people really like our green dot, and only the Holosun offers that. Some guys say green is a little bit easier to see. Personally, I have never had a problem seeing red, but if that's your thing, then you definitely get the Holosun. However, if you want a simple clean dot on the biggest glass there is, I mean, considering all the other dots in $300 category are not this size and of not this clarity, it doesn't have, certain features like, shake, wake, etc. I think the Bushnell is like right in there as far as offering a unique solution to it. And I think it's gonna get added popularity due to its price points. All right, fellas, that's it for me. So I got some more stuff coming down the pipe, so stay tuned. Can't stop this signal, so see you guys later.